G'day, listeners. You are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm your host, Trent, and today Michael will be joining me. How are you going, Michael?
Yeah, not too bad. Getting towards the end of the year, some nicer weather, doing a bit of Christmas shopping. You know how it is.
Oh, that's good to hear. All right. Well, we got a lot to cover today, so we'll get stuck straight into it with some listener comments from our last episode. At Convict Settler Association commented and said, "We already have white communities. They are everywhere away from the central hubs. We need to get into local councils to protect our communities and our areas. Indians are infiltrating local governments at an alarming pace. They vote along ethnic lines. We need to convince our own. If we don't protect it, we will lose it." Any comments on that, Michael?
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit of an equivocation between white communities generally in a disorganized sense and white communities as we mean it, which is an organized centralizing of, consciously heritage Australian people in one area. So, yeah, there are different ways you can do that. One of those, is to organize people that are nationalists and get them to move in one area. And then another way you can do that is to wake people up who are, all around Australia and ideally a whole bunch of people in one place who can do things, right? But it's not easy. If only it was easy to do, but we're trying to do both today.
Yeah, well said. And thanks for the comment, Convict Settler Association. All right, we'll move on, and we're gonna have a poem today that's quite related to the theme of the episode. It's the Song of Tobruk. They brought us from Australia to fight the Nazi Hun, who are once more on a warpath, well equipped with tank and gun. They dumped us in Libya, where the guidebooks say it's grand, but forgot to mention little things like flies and fleas and sand. Tobruk was chosen as a place for us to strut our stuff. Old Jerry soon besieged it and began to treat us tough. He dropped a kindly hint or two as to how we were to cop it, advising us to turn it in, forget the war and hop it. Now, being mad Australians, we didn't like the drum, and he made things darn well hum. Now, some blokes took the final count, and some joints got knocked about, but the damage done, as the Tommies say, was really bleeding out. He keeps on raiding with his planes, dropping bombs and booby traps. His soldiers sometimes make a move, and the lads have frontline scraps. But months have passed, he must admit, it seems like we are here to stay, till the Springboks come to join us, marching up from Barty Way. Now, when we all are home at home again, and this strife is over, some silly mug is sure to say, "How did you win the war?" You can look at that bloke right in the face and pat the baby curls. Say we defended all Tobruk where there wasn't any girls. Of all the units we have here, there's one we'd like to toast. There's always up to something, but you'll never hear them boast. It's grand to hear them working with a reverberating cheer. We dip our lids sincerely to the good old pioneer. And that was written, I think, by a soldier that was stationed at Tobruk. The lineage of the poem is not quite clear. What do you think of that one, Michael?
Yeah, it's a nice, simple, straightforward a poem. I think it's a very good one. So that heartfelt toasts to that particular unit. So I think you're probably right in that it would have been someone that was there. I think it's a campaign that was very important, and I'm sure we'll get into it a bit today because it comes from the same part of the war that Menzies was in, although the Libya campaign continued after Menzies was out and Curtin replaced him. But very significant to Australia in a way, in the sense that really the campaign was about preserving the integrity of the empire and the ability to project power to the Far East through the Suez Canal and control over Egypt. And there was a lot of concern over the fate of the empire if Egypt was lost. So we'll talk a bit about some of those specifics, I'm sure, as we go.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't think we've mentioned it yet. The topic of today, we're going to be doing an exploration of David Day's book, Menzies and Churchill at War. So David Day is an Australian historian. He's got a pretty extensive catalogue of books, a few Prime Ministers' biographies, as well as a bunch of other studies on Australia's relationship with the rest of the Anglosphere, particularly during the period of the Second World War. So probably the best way to introduce this book would be to just read the blurb. So I'll do that, and that'll give us an idea of what we're getting into.
Just before we jump into that, do we want to do just a few generalities about why talk about World War II?
Oh, yes, we should. We should cover that. Um, well, we're living in really the post World War II world, geopolitically, culturally, like in the mentalities that people have. I think that this period had a really profound impact upon the entire world, but especially Australians. Did you have any like specific things about this that you wanted to point out?
Well, I think it's important to say that it was a key turning point against nationalism in the post-war era.
Mm,
Sort of the way that the war was interpreted and propagandized to Western peoples was that it was sort of a war that came about due to nationalism and racism and this sort of stuff. And as a result of that, you get the rise of the civil rights era in the United States and in Australia as well. And so, it doesn't really matter who you talk to. Like most people will admit this sort of thing. Even I was reading a while ago the National Conservative book by Yoram Hazony, who's a Jewish guy, right? With this sort of new version of neoconservatism, you could almost say. And he was saying the same thing. He's saying that in the post World War II era, there's this poisoning of nationalism because obviously he's working to rehabilitate a sense of civic nationalism, sort of controlled opposition type thing. But I think, yeah, we have to acknowledge, along with him, along with all the people who said it before him, that this is a key turning point against nationalism, against eugenics, and all of that sort of stuff. So that's one key aspect to it.
mm,
The other thing I kind of wanted to say about it was that in terms of the Australian experience as well, this is where you get that turning point where after this, the British Empire is really being dismantled. You have the USA and the USSR rising as superpowers. We have that sort of turning of Australia from an empire-centric view to a more US-centric view, even though that's still to be played out. That doesn't really happen quite as simply as is often thought with this, Curtin's famous appeal that we need to turn to the US in the during the war after Pearl Harbor and the bombing of Darwin and all of that.
mm.
Yeah, so those are kind of the 2 points that I wanted to put out there. What do you reckon?
Oh, well, I agree with what you just said. One thing that's also worth noting is this is going to focus in particularly on Robert Menzies, and he obviously went on to found the Liberal Party. And I think learning about him, the more I learn about him, the more I sort of see that the Liberal Party is like a spiritual continuation of Robert Menzies, of his attitude, his worldview, and if you understand Robert Menzies, perhaps you'll understand the Liberal Party a bit better, which is something that's useful today. That's something that we're still dealing with as well.
Yeah, I'd have to say I have a lot more to read Menzies. I'm interested in Menzies. I'm interested in Curtin. World War II isn't really, in terms of this specific material, wasn't really something I was super familiar with going in. So I'm sure we'll do more podcasts on it, but this is an interesting entry into it with a bit of a controversial book. So maybe, take us into the book a bit.
All right. So this is the blurb from the book. In 1941, in the midst of the British military defeats in Greece and the Middle East, a bitter conflict was taking place between two of the most charismatic leaders of the time, Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, were engaged in a war of the polite public faces and the behind-the-scenes lobbying and manipulation. At issue were the conflicting demands of prosecuting the war while protecting the British Empire. Menzies was impelled by sympathy and self-interest to protect the integrity of the empire in its pre-war form. If necessary, by securing a compromise peace with the Axis powers, Churchill, on the other hand, was determined to sustain a policy of total victory, even at the expense of an England he was entrusted to protect. So deep were the divisions between these two men that Menzies was to make a determined attempt to wrest the British Prime Ministership from Churchill's grasp. Menzies and Churchill at War, a controversial and widely heralded bestseller in England and Australia, shows that Menzies was far from alone in adopting a critical stance towards Churchill in early 1941. Increasing numbers of British politicians, businessmen, and military leaders shared his concerns. To some of them, Menzies appeared an outstanding alternative to Churchill, and they actively conspired to promote in the minds of both Menzies and the general public the possibilities that Menzies' destiny lay at 10 Downing Street. Drawing on his meticulous research into the private papers and diaries of just such men and of Menzies himself, historian David Day outlines and documents in highly readable fashion this fascinating struggle for power. It is an episode that neither Menzies nor Churchill, for different reasons, wished to be subjected to future scrutiny, and in later years, both sought to gloss over their previous conflict. This major book sets the record straight. All right. So, first impressions going in, did you have any opinion on this topic, one way or the other, before you read the book?
Well, I have to say, I already had a quite a negative view on Churchill.
Yeah.
Not based on a very thorough understanding of the sources. As I said, it's not an area that I've spent a whole lot of time on, but I do know there's some material on how he was perhaps working for interests that were not very friendly to the British Empire, or at least had their own agendas. Those being, certain Zionist elements and so on. And
Yeah.
I mean, the result at the end of the day was that he did destroy the empire with the way he prosecuted the war. And there was some interesting material in this book that pointed out that there were a few people that understood that was going to be the result. And as the blurb said, this book suggests that Menzies, one of his goals was to sort of preserve the empire by rolling Churchill, essentially, which, as we'll see, I'm not sure that the book really established, but I certainly came out of it with still a negative view of Churchill and a bit more interest in Menzies. How about you?
I came into this with not a particularly positive view of either of these politicians for the reasons that you've outlined. That it's interesting David Day doesn't touch on any of that in this book. It's essentially a conspiracy theory book. It's like quite well researched and footnoted and whatnot, but it's a conspiracy theory. He is sort of connecting dots or painting the dots for you to connect and draw certain conclusions. But yeah, I found it. I shouldn't have been surprised that he didn't touch on any of the sort of controversy or conspiracy theory surrounding Churchill and the political faction that was backing him.
Yeah, no, he spends more time on possible counterfactions and that sort of.
Yes,
and it was interesting to me the views of Lloyd George, because again, Lloyd George was, I believe, the British Prime Minister during World War One, and I didn't know a whole lot about him, and I am more interested about him having read this book because he seems to be one of the people that understood that the Empire didn't really have the capacity to wage the war and win the war. Like they could fight, but the result was going to be the slow erosion of the empire without any victories, and the eventual necessity that the empire would have to turn to some sort of outside savior, which at the end of the day was going to have to be the United States, because obviously Nazi Germany went to war with the USSR, and there's a whole bunch of stuff around that, and whether that was necessary and all of that strategically for them. But from the empire perspective, it's sort of like you get the impression that it was this cult of personality around Churchill, and there's a lot in this book about how Churchill was extremely dominant in the war cabinet. He had all these yes men around him, and one of the interesting things is that Menzies was willing to go in and say, hang on a minute, there needs to be somebody who can stand up to this guy, because people are just saying yes to him, and he's making these terrible strategic decisions, which unfortunately Menzies wasn't really able to do very much about it, as we see.
There was some pretty significant failures on Menzies' part as well, but we'll get to that. The book it really like laser focuses in on the period of the Second World War when he was Prime Minister until he resigned, and it covers a little bit of his activities after he resigned and when he was a backbencher, but he wasn't really doing much. He was politically sidelined for the most part. So,
Do you want to give us a few names and dates then to set a bit of context and of the timeline?
yes. So the Second World War begins on the 1st of September 1939. Menzies resigned as PM and leader of the UAP on the 28th of August 1941. So it was a pretty short tenure as PM. I'll just start running through the book. I've picked out what I thought was interesting and relevant, and we'll run through it and comment on it as we go. So Menzies was having a weekend away in Colac, Victoria, when he received the news that Germany had crossed the border into Poland. So this was the start of war in Europe. And this is just an interesting little aside, a little bit of trivia. Andrew Fisher was in Colac in 1914 when he received the word that war had broken out in Europe in the First World War.
So don't go to Colac if you're the PM. Got it?
Yeah, but total ban on that. So obviously there'd been plenty of unrest in Europe in the years leading up to this, or really there hadn't been much of a period of peace since the First World War in Europe. Menzies had been a pretty strong supporter of the Munich Agreement. In 1938, there was an appeasement policy, and parts of Czechoslovakia were carved off and given to Germany. And in the as things were getting closer to Germany crossing that border into Poland, Menzies had been sort of ignoring the warning signs, and he'd been refusing to do any war preparations and telling the Australian public that peace was pretty much a certainty.
I can make a comment here briefly.
Yes, please do.
Just so that we don't lean into the glazing of curtain and bullying
we
of
want
Menzies
it to be
too much.
Yeah, we want it to
which
be,
may sometimes happen in the association.
Yeah,
I do feel obliged to point out against the narrative that sometimes goes out that in the lead up in the years before the war, every time there were votes on increasing the military budget and getting more military equipment, the Labor Party came out in absolute opposition to it each and every time. And so, I think it's really a testament to the success of the Labor Party under Curtin that they were able to spin a certain narrative on the start of the war and how Menzies went about things, that they were able to create this perception. I think there was definitely some blame to be had on the side of the Labor Party as well. Even a good example of this narrative control thing is the nickname that Menzies got of Pig Iron Bob. I'm not sure if you've got that in
I left
timeline.
I left that out of the timeline.
Yeah, no, the famous incident where there was I think it was the dock workers were striking and refusing to load iron onto ships that were going to take it for trade to Japan. And obviously, as we've talked about many times in the podcast, in Australian history, there's always been a perception that our real threat is from Asia, the Yellow Peril. And especially we were concerned about Japan, rightfully so, at this time. And, Menzies forced it through, forced it through so that the strike was broken and the iron went to Japan. And he got this nickname of Pig Iron Bob because of it, as seen as a sort of almost traitorous move. But privately, Curtin was basically chastising the strikers and telling them that if Labor was in power, he'd be doing the exact same thing. So it's one of those interesting power propaganda. Just want to create a bit of balance on that side. The other thing on the appeasement side is I've got in front of me a little essay from Anne Henderson, and I know we've got another one from her later, but it's interesting. This is from Zachary Gorman's series on Menzies, which is a Menzies glazing project.
Yeah.
But she's got a chapter in there called Peace and War. And she starts it off with this quote from 9th of May, 1939 in the House of Representatives, where the new Menzies government set aside a day to debate the growing tension in international affairs and Australia's potential response to the expansionist aims of Germany. And then she says, and a leading MP rises to his feet and argues this, quote, the efforts of the British government in its negotiations for peace were to some extent made difficult by the partisan activities of those who are more concerned, as it were, with fighting Hitler than with establishing peace. There is unquestionably in the world a class that has a vested interest in war and war making, and the propagandistic activities which are employed in the interests of this exploiting and ruthless class, which is international in character, have made difficulties for all governments, including, I believe, the governments of dictators. And she says, take a stab at who that was. I'll tell you, John Curtin. I think there is when I read it, there's a couple of hints in there. Obviously, the strong mention of class, right? International class that has a vested interest in war making, which would be your sort of financier, banker class, and that sort of thing. But yeah, so sort of you got to remember at this time that nobody really wanted war, and appeasement was sort of the general policy, at least as mainstream historiography would have it. So
yes,
yeah.
So after Churchill, Menzies received the news, he cabled Chamberlain, the British PM, and said Australia did not see differences between Germans and Poles as being worth a war. He also sent a letter to Australia's High Commissioner in England and said Germany had an almost unanswerable case for taking Danzig and the Polish corridor. And this is a quote from the letter to the High Commissioner, there is probably no answer to it all except to just go on fighting until the other country goes down into a state of starvation and riot, in which the seeds of another war in which my grandchildren will fight are sown. But at the same time, I see no sanity in it. So I think that's Menzies expressing himself pretty clearly there, that he's not keen on this European war and being dragged into it. He was backed up as well. The Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King, he made a call for an immediate truce and to have a committee of neutral countries examine the dispute, sort of League of Nations proto-UN style solution. But despite all that, when Australia learned that Britain had declared war, Menzies declared that Australia was at war also within an hour, or just over an hour later, sorry.
Yeah, and I really don't think he had any other option. But I think before that, with the the different dominions being against the war, I see that's kind of a continuation in that difference between the perception of world politics between the settler states of the British Empire, the white settler states, and the empire at home. In that we were always more concerned about the problems in Asia, and that comes through very clearly in this book, as we'll get into, I'm sure. But back on the home isles, right, on the British Isles, there was much more obsession with Europe, as of course is understandable given the history and the consciousness and the way they saw things. But I think at the end of the day, in the Dominions, we were a lot more forward-looking in terms of the real threats. It's very unfortunate the way things played out, and I think personally, from what I've looked at, I think that Menzies was right in that Germany had pretty much an unanswerable case for taking Danzig and the Polish corridor.
Yeah,
and I'm sure our Germanophile friends would agree with that. So it is quite unfair played out.
Yeah. And there's a couple of other points that are telling us that that Australia is not invested in this war. They don't want to be involved. Just things like the army was issued cotton underwear, and the War Council refused to approve issuing warmer wool underwear because they were like, they're not going to need it. We're not going to be gone that long. We're not going to be there in the winter. So to me, that's pretty telling. Yeah. Now, while this is happening in Australia, over in England, there is a political battle brewing between Churchill and Chamberlain. So under Chamberlain, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was put in charge of the Norwegian campaign, and he totally botched it. And this fiasco essentially led to Chamberlain being replaced with Churchill, of failing upwards, which is when you look into Churchill's life, it seems to be a bit of a pattern with him. And now this, coming back to Australia, it puts Menzies in a pretty interesting position because 11 weeks earlier, in a letter to the High Commissioner, he had referred to Churchill as a menace and said he stirs up hatred in a world already seething with, and he is lacking in judgment. So pretty clear endorsement of Menzies' opinion of Churchill as well.
Yeah, I think most historians would agree that Menzies had sort of a love-hate relationship with Churchill, and I think from this we can see that it started with the hate. And I think when he ended up in Britain on his extended visit there, to some extent he was taken in by Churchill's spell, because for all his faults, he was a master of strategic disaster, but he was a highly consummate politician, charismatic, able to get people on side. So I think that's really the tragedy, I guess, of Churchill, in that he was such a cunning and effective politician in terms of, I suppose you would say, domestic policy, but then he was, so bad, or maybe if the conspiracists are to be believed, so good at destroying the empire.
All right. So Menzies' position was that the US would need to support a negotiated peace in order for a solution to be reached. That was his ideal solution. The Australian public was very concerned about Britain, as they still very much viewed themselves as British. So even though there was this like a huge amount of concern in Australia, Menzies would not introduce conscription though, as it likely wouldn't be accepted, and he had a very thin majority, and it would have just destroyed him politically, I think, to try and introduce conscription at that time. Australia's first contributions to the war effort, they had 49 Hudson aircraft, which they'd ordered from the States, and they were diverted to Britain to help with Britain's war effort. And by mid-1940, Germany is winning the war. They've occupied France. France has fallen. The Dunkirk evacuation is underway. The Italians have now entered the war, and shortly they'll be followed by the Japanese. The Russians have signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and America is still resolutely isolationist. So it's not looking good. It's not looking good for Britain at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Yanks were very happy to just sit back and watch the empire explode, which is, when we look at it civilizationally and across, the decline of the West and all of this sort of stuff, quite tragic, and something that would come home to roost perhaps in time. But I think Peter Hitchens is someone who's interesting to read on this, and he points out things like, with the Lend-Lease agreements that the Americans had with Britain had to send all their gold over to the United States. So basically, the Americans looted the treasury of the empire, took all the gold, and even they were traded things like bases. So you got this slow shift of British Empire towards American Empire, and that's even at the start of the war, before the Americans are even into it. So I think Peter Hitchens is fundamentally right that the Americans were never really, the Anglo-American friendship is very played up. The Americans were always happy to exploit the situation, and that really is shown when you get to the Suez Canal crisis. But that's all the way post-war. So
yes,
still under Menzies. Menzies was furious about how the Americans handled that. That's for sure, because Menzies was always a staunch empire man, and I think his love of empire comes through clearly in the book with his fears that Churchill was going to destroy it, fears which are justified. But as we'll see, I don't think Day necessarily makes the case that Menzies was actually aiming to get rid of Churchill. But keep going, because we go.
All right. We've got Menzies came out after the Dunkirk evacuation, and he described it as a triumph and a symbol of what Britain would achieve in the future, an achievement which would lead to ultimate victory. Now, this is the side of Menzies that I really detest. This just catastrophic military defeat, and then coming out and calling it a triumph. And as you said before, he had this sort of love-hate relationship with Churchill. I think he's just someone that talks out of both sides of his mouth. Very just a politician in the derogatory sense of that word.
Yeah. I mean, I see him in some ways as almost naive in some of the ways that this plays out.
Yes.
I mean, if Day is right about everything, then he was trying to do the best thing he could for the empire in trying to get rid of Churchill, because we'll see that when he goes on this trip to England to get more support for Australia because of fears of Japanese involvement, that he is outmaneuvered by Churchill every step of the way. And that's whether he went there just for war materials and manufacturing industrial capabilities for Australia to build fighter aircraft and that sort of stuff, or whether he felt like he could position himself to eventually be PM, right, of Britain, the top man of the empire. In either case, Churchill totally outmaneuvered him, basically lied to him about certain things in terms of the war strategy, tried to keep him out of the war cabinet as much as possible. So,
okay, so with the war situation not going well in Britain, there is the beginnings of a political bloc, maybe you could call it a cabal in Britain that opposes war with Germany, and they oppose Churchill. There's some very powerful members. Lady Astor, she was Britain's first female MP, I believe, and her family is also one of those mega rich, Rothschild level super wealth families. So very influential. Lloyd George, who you mentioned before, was the former prime minister during the First World War. Lord Beaverbrook, who was a politician. He also owned the Daily Express, which was the newspaper with the largest circulation in the world at that time. So very influential fellow. And Lord Kemsey as well, another politician that owned another newspaper. So this is a pretty powerful block of people that are forming up, that are opposed to Churchill's leadership. They're not happy with how things are going. Now there's an aborted attempt to capture Dakar, but the Allied forces of British and the Free French are defeated by the Vichy French forces. Menzies only discovered after the fact that there had been an Australian battlecruiser involved. This led to him contacting Churchill and criticising him and pressuring him to keep the Dominions informed. As you can imagine, this would have been really politically embarrassing for Menzies if it was discovered and made public that Australian military battleships were away in foreign theatres and the Prime Minister didn't even know about it, taking part in ill-fated military expeditions. So Lord Kemsey contacted Menzies about a newspaper campaign he was mounting to create an imperial war cabinet. So Menzies declined to comment publicly, but he was encouraging them to. He was making public calls to call an imperial conference of the Dominion prime ministers. The British War Cabinet responded to him, and they said the imperial conference was just going to be too difficult to organise, but he was welcome to come and attend the War Cabinet. Now, the other Dominion prime ministers, it was unlikely that they were ever going to be interested in this imperial conference. In South Australia, Prime Minister Smuts, or in Canada,
sorry, South Africa.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
South Africa. I had it as SA in my note, and my Australian chauvinism took over. South African Prime Minister Smuts and the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. They would not have been keen on this conference. They were both in a pretty insecure political position, and they had fractured populations. The French Canadians and South Africa's Afrikaner contingent did not want their country to be drawing closer to Britain, especially at a time like this. So the Imperial Conference was out, but Menzies was welcome to the War Cabinet. So he set off for London on the 24th of Jan in 1941. And he had a couple of goals. He wanted to secure fighters for Australia's defence against possible invasion by Japan. And he wanted to secure capital for industrial development in Australia. And before he arrived, there was already a bit of a press news media blitz going on promoting him. And some of the descriptions are quite funny. They're describing him as this Giga Chad. This is a quote, over 6 feet in height, broad and muscular in proportions. So the British press was very clearly building this guy up And if you haven't seen a picture of Menzies, he's not that impressive a physical specimen. He was like a paunchy politician, essentially. So Menzies sets off to London. He takes with him Shedden. He's the Secretary of the Defence Department, and Story. He is I think he's the head of the aircraft production. He's attached to the aircraft production in Australia. Now, notably, and I think this was an oversight that Menzies would come to regret, the party didn't include any military officers or experts. This left Menzies without independent military advice and somewhat at the mercy of the British War Committee or War Cabinet. So the party took the route via Singapore and the Middle East in order to survey the situation over there. Now, David Day, he's pretty subtly critical of Menzies a fair bit throughout the book, and he claims that Menzies took this route over the safer passage via America because he wanted the political boost that would come from visiting the troops. I don't know if that's accurate, but in saying that, the Australian Army Minister Percy Spender had only just recently returned from surveying the situation in both Singapore and the Middle East. So I think Menzies would have gotten some pretty good information on what was happening there. So perhaps David Day does have a point. Anyway, when Menzies arrived in Singapore, he was worried. He was worried about what he saw. There was no major naval units, and there was a lack of equipment, and he thought the commanders there were pretty poor and defeatist. They were, in his estimation, not ready for fight. So
this would be a common story because we'll see this later on with the Great Campaign, and then in Crete as well. They had a hopeless general in Crete. But we do have to remember that, unfortunately, a lot of great potential was lost. And I guess that's true for Germany as well. But it seems that Britain didn't recover quite as well in terms of its army capacity.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And if I'm like blasting through and sort of glossing over some of the military stuff, I'm just trying to focus on this the main thread of the book, which is this supposed conspiracies that Menzies was trying to replace Churchill at the head of the empire. The point of the podcast is not to be a military history podcast, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over a lot of stuff just for the sake of time. After moving on from Singapore, Menzies arrived in the Middle East, and he timed it pretty well. He arrived there just as the Allied forces captured Tobruk, and they took 30,000 Italian prisoners. So things were going good in that particular theatre. And at that time, Churchill ordered the halt of the British advance, and he also split the forces, preparing to send a big chunk of them over to Greece, which would eventually open the door for Rommel to get his foot in and reverse the situation in the Middle East. Menzies felt that his reception was much better abroad than it was at home, noting in his diary, and this is a quote from his diary, "A prophet is never without honour save in his own country and among his own people," which is that's a pretty wild quote. So
it seems to be a recurrent thing with Menzies that he was always very Britain-centric.
Yeah, and
he didn't feel entirely at home in Australia, at least at this point in his life.
Yeah, I think that's just part of the rough and tumble of Australian political life. Arriving in a foreign country just as they've won a significant military objective. They would have been riding high. They would have been happy to see him, and perhaps in Australia, people would not have been so happy to see the Prime Minister. All right, it's worth noting here. There's a lot of references to cables, letters, and particularly to some of Menzies' diaries. David Day made a claim at the start of the book that Menzies had said he would be happy if his descendants destroyed all his papers. This claim isn't footnoted or attributed anywhere, and I tried to look for it, and I found a bunch of stuff attributing this quote to Neville Chamberlain. So I don't know if Menzies also said this, or this was a misquote, or I don't know. But I just thought I'd bring that up. And I've got a few more quotes here that I thought were interesting. One about the troops that he saw in the Middle East, mere boys in the flower of their youth, many of whom will never see Australia again. War is the abomination of desolation. And another one, sweating taxpayers of Italy probably thought that Libya was worth it because it looked fine and large when painted the Italian colour on the map. So you can see Menzies' sort of rhetoric skills and charisma coming out in some of his diary quotes, or I think I can see it.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point that Day makes, that Menzies was never comfortable spending troops in campaigns in the same way that Churchill was. Churchill was a lot more of a realist, more hard headed. That probably wasn't a good thing given how he constantly made errors, like going into Greece.
Mm.
But yeah, I think that was a good character trait on the part of Menzies, that he legitimately like felt for these people and cared about them and didn't want to see their lives wasted. It seems to be like a common thread of Australian leadership. Maybe I'm being a bit idealistic about it, but if you think to World War One, Monash and even Blamey, and Blamey would be one of the head generals for the Australian forces, and yeah, I mean the British officers never seem to want to preserve Australian troops in the same way that the Australian officers did. So,
Well, speaking of that, while he was in the Middle East, General Blamey, the commander of the Australian Imperial Force, made very strong arguments to Menzies. He wanted to congregate all of the Australians together under an Australian commander. So there was this sense that the Australians were receiving the hard end of the fighting and being placed under the command of incompetent British commanders. So Menzies moves on from the Middle East, arrives in Britain. It's the end of a hard winter for the British. Lots of bombings, blackouts, and the press, they'd been pumping up his tires before he arrived. And when he got there, they seized on him as a bit of a positive figure and spread his message that Britain was not alone and the whole empire was behind her. So I think Menzies arrived and there was a bit of a morale campaign going on, and he probably benefited from that boost to his public profile and perception from the public. The Daily Telegraph warmly greeted Menzies as the personification of the staunch and stalwart spirit which our Australian kinsmen have so characteristically shown in the Empire's time of supreme peril. His speeches were described by the paper as having a tonic quality of high confidence and resolution, which will find a ready echo here. So the public is getting word about this Menzies fellow, who's very very positive, and he's like a shot into the arm of the British people. Menzies, he hits the ground running. He's straight into meetings with cabinet ministers, starting off with a lunch to discuss the problems of Irish neutrality. And I've got a quote here from the book. I'm not going to be able to say this any better than David Day. So I'm quoting now. The Irish question had important implications for Australia, with its large Irish community, most of whom were Labor supporters. If Menzies could do something to solve this Australian voters problem, he could presumably help to secure his own position by winning over some of the Irish Australian voters. Irish neutrality also carried awful implications for the Empire. The policy of neutrality denied Irish ports to the ships of the Royal Navy and raised the possibility of a backdoor German attack on Britain by way of Ireland. To prevent this possibility, Churchill might feel well impelled to station British forces in the country forcibly. This raised the spectre of an intra-imperial war that would, among other things, create dangerous splits within the Australian society, likely to threaten its war effort. End quote. Similar to the South Africans and the Canadians, this multi-ethnic society, it's harder to unify them, and this is really a perennial problem, a problem that we're still facing today. Yeah, it's amazing. Every time I do these podcasts, like when the history stuff comes up, I sound like a broken record, just constantly pointing out how much things are the same as they were, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. All right. So after that, Menzies went on to meet with Churchill, and he stayed at Chequers. he tried to broach some solutions to the Irish problem, but Churchill was not having any of it. Menzies would later on in his trip end up diverting his attention from pressing for Australian needs and visit the Irish PM de Valera in Dublin. He went with no message of support from Churchill and essentially had to negotiate just off his own back and was understandably unsuccessful in achieving anything.
Yeah, that was not a great side quest on his part.
No, and as David,
it really didn't do him any favors either, because I think Dave mentions he misses some important communication he's doing that.
Yes. Yeah, and Day is making the point that he was doing this for like political expediency, for his own political benefit, when he probably should have been. Well, he definitely should have been carrying out his role in representing Australia. Menzies had the Greek expedition that would mainly consist of Australian and New Zealand troops foisted upon him. He had failed to prepare, and Blamey had failed to prepare him for the probability that Australian troops would be sent to Greece and the low chances of military success. So that's Menzies' poor planning and not bringing the right people with him to give him the right advice, the right military advice, coming back to bite him.
I believe this is also a case where Churchill lies to Menzies and basically says,
yes,
"Oh yeah, our generals definitely consulted Blamey and he was fine with it, and this is going to turn out really well. It's a great move." And in the meantime, people are telling Churchill, this is strategically incredibly risky. Blamey, I'm pretty sure Blamey hadn't even been really consulted, and later on, Blamey sends a message to Menzies like, "What are we doing here? This isn't good."
Yeah, there's a couple of these at the 11th hour when the Greek expedition is pretty much underway. Churchill goes to the War Cabinet and he's like, "All right, we need to stop it. You need to say so now. Now that I've sort of forced this thing through, and it's the 11th hour, we're all going to share the blame if it goes wrong."
Yeah, this is like a common Churchill tactic as well. He'd make these terrible moves, and then he'd be able to create a situation where he could spread the blame for it to other people. Which I mean, you pointed out the Norway disaster earlier, which toppled the Chamberlain government, and that was a Churchill operation. I mean, Churchill was responsible, if we go back to World War I, for Gallipoli as well.
Yeah, not
much. I'm not a huge Churchill fan, that's for sure.
No, I won't be running out and joining up with the International Churchill Society. All right, Menzies was invited to start attending the War Cabinet, and once he got there, he was horrified that no one would push back against Churchill. Initially, he referred to the cabinet as yes men in letters that he wrote to the High Commissioner, and he later wrote in his diary, I'm quoting from Menzies' diary now, "The cabinet is deplorable, dumb men, most of whom disagree with Winston, but none of whom dare to say so. The state of affairs is most dangerous. The chiefs of staff are without exception yes men, and a politician runs the services. Winston is a dictator. He cannot be overruled, and his colleagues fear him. The people have set him up as something little less than a god, and his power is therefore terrific." End quote. So that's a little insight into what was happening in the War Cabinet in London. Menzies is now starting to realise the full extent of the predicament that he finds himself in. There's 3 Australian divisions in the Middle East. Australian troops are committed to Greece, and all the while there's an increasingly hostile Japan on Australia's doorstep. And any move for the British Navy to defend Australia would weaken the defences for the Australian troops that are stationed all over the place.
In the Mediterranean.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so it spread very thin with Australia essentially left undefended.
Yeah, the other problem for Churchill here is that we haven't covered is that he messaged back to, I think it was Arthur Fadden, who was holding fort for him back in Australia, and he's like, yeah, we were consulted properly and everything on this Greece operation, and it only comes out to Menzies afterwards that Churchill's screwed him over and lied to him. And at this point, he's already basically sent the confirmation back to Australia, so his head's on the block as well.
Yes, and Menzies had not informed the Australian war cabinet about this. So the Labor politicians on the war cabinet were completely unawares that Australian troops were being sent to Greece. So it's like compounding failures, you know.
Yeah, there were a lot of issues here.
Mm.
I might have gotten that bit wrong. I
No,
can't remember, but
that was correct.
yeah, no, he did. He was it just Fadden only that he told he was informed? Because I know that afterwards he's going to try and get like everyone back home to sort of like agree to take the blame for the operation. Rightfully so. The Labor politicians say, "No, this is your screw up."
Yeah, yeah. He has agreed to send the Australian troops to Greece, and then like after the fact, he realizes, oh, I better get the Australian War Cabinet to agree to this thing that I've already approved, and they don't do it. So yeah. Now Menzies shifts his focus. He's trying to secure fighters for the Far East. This goes against the British policy of concentrating their forces in the fight against Italy and Germany. But Menzies is he really wants some planes to be sent to, not even necessarily to Australia, to Singapore, just so they're in the area with the thought that this would help Australia's defences.
Yeah, well, at this point, all of our eggs were in the Singapore strategy basket, so that was really a failure of pre-war Australian defence policy. But anyway.
While this is happening, German troops are massing in Bulgaria and they're getting ready to assault Greece. And Rommel is also beating back the depleted forces in the Middle East. And I have another quote from the book here. Throughout the century and a half of British settlement in Australia, the Royal Navy had provided the basic guarantee of Australia's defence. Till now, no serious threat had eventuated, and Australia had never had to test the worth of the guarantee. The concept involved of the Royal Navy maintaining a seven seas capability and patrolling extensively, rather than actually basing units in colonial waters, had allowed successive generations of Australians to sleep more or less peacefully in their beds. Now, when they anxiously scanned their ports and harbours for the smokestacks of British warships, they saw only troop ships transporting the produce and men of Australia to the war in Europe. Though Menzies might personally discount the possibility of a Japanese attack against Australia, he was conscious that it was politically imperative for him to make preparations for such an eventuality. End quote. All right, so basically, no ships for Australia, no planes for Singapore. So this is what I've got another quote from the book, and this is the this bit that you were talking about with Menzies not notifying the Labor Party. General Blamey approached the Australian government seeking to make his views known on the Greek expedition. This was the first intimation that Menzies would have any possible misgivings by the Australian commander. It now really was too late to reverse the decision to aid Greece, and Blamey's cable was a serious embarrassment to Menzies. He had long assured his Australian colleagues that Blamey backed the expedition. Menzies had, however, neither sought nor received Blamey's personal confirmation of such backing. As we have seen, he had instead relied on the advice of British Army Commander in the Middle East, General Wavell, that Blamey had been consulted and was in agreement with the decision. Menzies now found that the Greek expedition was causing him increasing political problems in Australia. With Blamey stressing the extremely hazardous nature of the operation, on the 11th of March, Menzies wrote to Churchill to pass on to the comments of his Australian colleagues who were becoming distinctly uneasy about Greece. In his letter, he asked Churchill to provide the military basis of the opinion favouring the venture. Menzies now seemed to be trying to form a solid front with Churchill to repel any political attacks from Australia. On the 14th of March, Menzies tried to spread the political risk of any disaster in Greece. Until then, he had not informed the Advisory War Council with its Labor Party component of the decision to send Australian troops to Greece. He now saw the folly of this omission and advised Fadden that he should discreetly inform the War Council, not showing them the actual telegrams but giving the substance of the proposals. If Menzies hoped for post facto Labor Party endorsement of the decision, he was to be disappointed. The Labor Party rightly refused to accept responsibility for a decision in which it had taken no part. Like Menzies, Churchill was also anxious to spread the political risk of looming disaster. Eden was the obvious fall guy, And on the 14th of March, Churchill cabled him in Cairo, urging him that he stay on in the Middle East until the opening phase of this crisis has matured. No one but you, Churchill cabled, can combine the concert the momentous policy which you have pressed upon us and which we have adopted. This was a clear warning by Churchill that if there was a political cost to pay over Greece, Eden would be the one to pay it. End quote. All right. So Blamey sent a dispatch to the Australian government that included a copy of a letter that he had sent to Menzies warning that the Greek operation was seriously hazardous and stating that he had not been consulted by his British superiors. So Fadden is understandably put out by this, and because Menzies has been telling him that Blamey has approved this and it's going to be a success. So he cables Menzies asking for the explanation, and Menzies noted that he had not received the letter and it was curious for Blamey to write and not cable on matters of such urgency. Now, this is an interesting little, like, just everyone covering their own butt, sending letters when they should be sending cables, and just trying to pass the buck. But yeah, a lot of problems are going on here. This is not a well-oiled military machine or a well-oiled political machine. It's actually, it's a bit of a clown show.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I really got out of the book. You just see how the empire was so horribly mismanaged, and I think Menzies, was fundamentally right in his concern of trying to get an imperial war cabinet going and trying to create a bit more opposition to Churchill in terms of having people with the spines to stand up to him. Because all the evidence, day marshals, it's a bit, as you say, conspiratorial as to whether Menzies ever really wanted to try and take that position from Churchill of PM. But it is very clear from the evidence, I mean, incontestable, because it's so, he's upfront about it all the time, that he really wanted that Imperial War Cabinet. He wanted the other Dominion leaders involved, or if not all of them, at least himself in the place, standing in as the Dominion representative for the rest of the Empire. And you're just seeing the Empire kind of falling apart with this sort of corruption from the inside, and the sort of borderlands of the Empire, or the outskirts of the Empire, like Churchill, couldn't really give a stuff about the Far East. He's like, the Far East is, Australia's not at war. We're not going to send anything there. We see that even Beaverbrook, whose papers were propping up Menzies, on the other hand, he was sort of, undermining him and making sure that he wouldn't get any aircraft or any industrial capacity to build aircraft in Australia that might take away from the British war effort.
Yeah,
which was short-sighted, because of course, like, it was pretty obvious that the Japs were going to kind of make a move. So
yeah, and it seemed that Beaverbrook was like, on the one hand, stringing Menzies along with assurances that he would get the fighter aircraft, but on the other hand, he was the one denying the requests. Menzies now turns his attention to trying to meet with British industrialists and capitalists, trying to turn Australia into a mass producer of aircraft for the Empire. Now, this, David Day claims, and I think this is probably pretty accurate, this was somewhat of a means to an end, with the ends being building up Australia's manufacturing capability and eventually having an Australian auto manufacturing industry. And I think that's fairly supported in the text. He spends a lot of time meeting with car manufacturers and talking with them. And while this is going on, the press is still promoting Menzies, and they're now calling for his services in the War Cabinet to be retained. Menzies had a meeting with Lord Kemsley, and Kemsley wrote in his diary after the meeting, "Interesting talk on the future of the Conservative Party after Winston. What? Question mark." So this is like kind of a critical point for David Day's theory that these powerful and prominent people in Britain have selected Menzies as a potential successor for Churchill. And On the 11th of March, Menzies addressed a meeting of the Empire Parliamentary Association and was given a standing ovation by 200 MPs. Menzies' diary stated that some of the British MPs would not mind my defeat at Canberra if they could get me to stay on in the Commons. Omnis ignotos pro magnifico, and that Latin roughly translates to any humble man may become great. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even if he didn't want to become PM, he, not of Australia, but he always had that ambition of, maybe I can make it at the heart of the empire. Maybe I can be, in the House of Commons, or so. Yeah, there is that aspect to it that is.
Definitely a very ambitious man. I think he's 47 now when he's prime minister, which is quite young for a prime minister. And he would go on to be Australia's longest serving prime minister. So he definitely wasn't someone that was lacking in ambition and drive. Meanwhile, in Australia, Menzies' stand-in, Fadden, is cabling him to confirm when he is returning to Australia. Now, this is a problem for Menzies because he hasn't actually achieved anything yet. So remember, the things that he wanted to do while he was there was secure fighter aircraft and secure manufacturing capability for Australia. And he has not got any fighter aircraft approved, and he is not really making any breakthroughs in his manufacturing plans. So it was at this time Menzies left London to go on a week-long tour of some of the industrial manufacturing plants. And I've got a quote from the book here. I'm quoting now. With his future in Australia largely riding on the success of his efforts to attract British industrial capital, Menzies was naturally furious to learn of a possible plan to manufacture American aircraft engines under license in Australia. He mistakenly believed the proposal had been approved by the Australian government in his absence and immediately cabled Fadden, taking the strongest exception to this decision, which renders quite futile all my discussions with aero engine manufacturers here. Menzies ordered Fadden to suspend government approval if possible. If it were not possible, Menzies angrily announced that he would at once terminate my conversations with British firms. So I don't think that speaks very, very well to Menzies. If the plan is to get aircraft and build up manufacturing capability, I guess the preferable person or source to help us do that would be the British, as we're part of the Commonwealth. But given the need, if the Americans are going to meet our needs, why not take them up on that? And I think the reason for that would be that Menzies would go away and achieve nothing while his stand-in would achieve his goals at home in Australia without him, and that would be politically very bad for him.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that doesn't reflect too well on Menzies. Also, he was, it's that fanatical pro-empire position he had as well that, we should be getting it from the British. If we can't get it from the British, then we shouldn't get it from anywhere. And the other aspect is that the Australians are hoping to get favourable trade in terms of, I think it was the agricultural output, that the Brits weren't buying enough of ours, and it was causing some economic problems. And Menzies was also supposed to sort this out, and he didn't really push that hard on it. He kind of accepted the British reasons and didn't push for it. So
due to shipping problems, Britain had been forced to cut back on purchase of primary products from Australia, and this caused huge problems for Australia. But the British government was still purchasing these primary foodstuffs, but they were using the Lend-Lease bill to buy American rather than Australian products, which is, we're supporting them in the war effort. We're sort of moving heaven and earth to, does this empire go both ways, or does it only go one way? That's the question that this raises for me. But anyway, this problem ended up being resolved for Australia when the Americans entered the Pacific. There was a big demand for Australia's products, so the economic problems were averted. Okay, I have another quote from the book. I'm quoting now. On his arrival back in London, Menzies was given notice by the High Commissioner Bruce that his political survival in Australia depended on wringing substantial concessions from Churchill. On 7th April, Bruce submitted a letter to Menzies urging him, apparently, to present it to Churchill. The letter was a blunt ultimatum setting conditions for Australia's continued participation in Britain's war effort. Bruce held out the prospect of the Menzies government falling and Australians' overseas forces being recalled when the Australian people realised their country had been put at risk by the imperial military commitment. Australia, he wrote, could no longer rely on her British naval protection, and if Japan attacked, a position it is not pleasant to contemplate would face us. If Australia was to continue to allow forces to serve overseas, two conditions must be met. Menzies had to be satisfied as to the adequacy of the air reinforcements it is proposed to send to the Far East, and had to be given reasonable assurance as to obtaining the planes required for the re-equipping and expansion of the Royal Australian Air Force. There is no indication that Menzies accepted the tenor of this letter, or that he even submitted it to Churchill. He was loath to press Britain too hard on the supply of the aircraft, since he felt her need was the greater. He was also loath to admit that imperial defence arrangements were designed to draw off strength of the empire for the protection of Britain, while leaving the outlying dominions covered by copious paper treaties and little else. Ultimately, he did make demands on Churchill, but it was to establish his own position in London rather than to ensure Australia's security for invasion by Japan. End quote. Yeah, so that kind of covered what we were just saying before about the needs of the center of the empire and the needs of the dominion being pitted against each other. All right, so just an update on what's happening in the war effort while this is going on in the political battleground. The Allied forces were retreating to Tobruk to make a stand. The Greek forces had been cut off, and thousands of British troops had been captured in Libya. The Germans were overpowering resistance in the Balkans. British ships were being ravaged by U-boat attacks, and there was continuing bombing raids all over London. And some of the aircraft production facilities had been significantly damaged, reducing aircraft production. All right, I have another quote here from the book. While Australia was pressing Menzies to urge for an evacuation, Churchill was being enticed by the spectre of recreating the Spartan stand at Thermopylae. He later recalled that, in his mind, the intervening ages fell away. Why not one more undying feat of arms? The problem was that the undying feat would have to be performed by mainly Australian troops, who would be mostly very dead at the end of it. Churchill recognised that Australia stood in the way of realising his dream, and he resented it deeply. He also felt that the evacuation was still premature, and even that the military situation could be reversed in Britain's favour. End quote.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting insight into Churchill's mind. Just has this retarded brainwave, oh, what if we do Thermopylae again? And that's kind of how he did strategy. The result of it was so damn bad. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's psychotic to think like that. Oh well, I think it is anyway. All right, it was in this atmosphere of gloom and doom that Menzies was due to return home to Australia. All right, he still had no concrete guarantee that the British fleet would assist Australia in case of Japanese attack, and he had not secured any of the Hurricane fighter planes that he had requesting. So Menzies asked Churchill to request that he stay on. So Churchill cabled Fadden. Fadden agreed. I think Fadden was probably pretty happy to agree to that. He was standing in as PM and probably enjoying it. Now, there was still that faction that I had mentioned earlier was pushing to have Menzies take a more prominent role. Kemsley's paper expressed the hope that Menzies' stay be prolonged indefinitely. In line with Menzies' own thoughts, it argued that the empire was a single entity, and we must have at the heart of it the best talent that any part of it can provide. The paper then confidently predicted that Menzies would take an increasingly important part in the affairs of the whole empire, and maintained, and this is a quote from a newspaper article, often before in the history of our island we have been able to say that the hour has brought forth Perhaps the Empire will have a chance of saying that too. There is every indication that Australia has sent us a man who will be of enormous value in the sustentation of the joint effort. The British press continuing to sort of bolster Menzies in the eyes of the public. But while this is going on, the Australian press is starting to get a little bit impatient, and they're calling for Menzies to return.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we need to go into too much detail on that, in the sense that that's kind of like setting the stage for pretty much how it's going to play out from here. Like, he's going to get a lot of positive coverage in the British press, this being Menzies, increasingly critical press at home when political issues developing, from all the times he's being outmaneuvered by Churchill, getting lied to, as we've covered with the Greece thing and Amy and all that, and basically failing his main objectives of, one, getting something for Australia's defence in the Far East in terms of, ideally support from the Navy, but if not that, then some fighter aircraft, and if not that, some industrial capacity for Australia to build its own fighter aircraft. And he doesn't get any of that. He doesn't get, the favourable markets and shipping for agricultural production. And he doesn't get the Imperial War Cabinet that he wanted, that would curb some of Churchill's power. And he certainly saw these blunders that Churchill was making at first hand. So, yeah, I think, I'm not sure how much longer you've got on spelling it out. Maybe we can get to like him leaving, and because there's not really much more to say beyond that, I think.
Let me skip forward a bit because we've been going for a while.
Yeah, I'm just conscious. Like, a lot of these points are kind of interesting, and there's a lot of good stuff in the book, but we're starting to kind of almost retrack ground, because he just doesn't get anywhere, which is kind of frustrating. One of the frustrating points to me of the book, and obviously it's a history book, and he's got to say what happened, but it's very annoying to see that Menzies kind of goes on like this side quest to Ireland. He's aware of the issues at the heart of the empire, but at the end of the day, as PM of Australia, he didn't really have any capacity to do anything about it. And obviously Day's thesis is maybe, with the support of some of these other figures like Lloyd George, who else did you say, Lady Astor, and a few others, potentially Beaverbrook. But I think the evidence that Day provides with, was kind of that Beaverbrook was manipulating Menzies. Like, he'd give him this good press, but then he would undercut him important stuff like the transfer of aircraft and stuff. So
yeah, well, the remainder of my notes on this section, it's just Menzies running around trying to get people to help him, meeting with people, and he goes on a tear of meeting with just a bunch of people that are vocally anti-Churchill and making noise about the execution of the war.
I think the one thing that we maybe could mention is that Lloyd George himself tried at one point the vote of no confidence. I think, was that right after Greece?
Churchill called that, and I think Churchill sort of beat him to it before he was ready, and staved off attack for
and he was
a little
calling
while.
like the Welsh Batain and stuff, basically like, you're this appeasing retard, kind of like the Vichy French, and you're betraying the cause. Fundamentally, Lloyd George was the person that I had the most sympathy with in the whole book. Like, I did come away with a reasonable amount of sympathies in seeing the problems, but I kind of felt sorry for the old Lloyd, who's, as it was said, conducted World War One with a bit more of an effective war cabinet, and then he sees that Churchill's just bungling everything. He fundamentally understands that strategically Britain can't win the war off its own back. This war is just going to destroy the empire, which he was 100% correct about. And Churchill's just on this mad crusade to destroy Nazi Germany for some reason. And I think this is somewhere where, I know I mentioned Hitchens before, but Hitchens' idea is that the British establishment in power were not fundamentally appeasers and didn't actually follow a policy of appeasement, but rather they did want to engineer the war, which is why they provided the guarantee to Poland in the first place. So I think, there could even be something to that. And then even getting into all the more conspiratorial stuff about, Anglo-American establishment and, the moving of power from from London towards Washington and so on. But
Alright.
anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a tangent.
No,
But,
that's good. All right, so
I think I just want to balance out because we're covering a lot of detail, but it's good to have the big picture as well.
yes, yeah. As I said, look, just Menzies running around trying to do stuff, and until he gives up, and he has to come home. He comes home via America, and there's a whole chapter of him essentially trying to maneuver things in America, trying to get the Americans on board, but again unsuccessfully. So he arrives home in Australia. The war effort is going very poorly. Greece is being evacuated or already been evacuated now, and he has nothing to show for 4 months away. He continues on trying to organise this imperial conference, but none of the other Commonwealth PMs are interested, not really. And I've got another quote from the book about his resignation. I'm quoting now. On the 28th of August, Menzies announced to the House of Representatives that the government had decided to dispatch a minister other than the Prime Minister to London as soon as possible. He had then adjourned the House for several weeks' recess and proceeded to a meeting of his cabinet where he announced to his UAP colleagues his intention to resign. Few asked him to reconsider. Within a few hours, a joint meeting of UAP and the Country Party members had voted to elect Fadden into the ministerial chair. It had been widely remarked that Menzies resigned without rancour or bitterness and in a surprisingly cheerful frame of mind. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that he had already arranged with Fadden that he would resign on the condition that he, Menzies, be the minister to be dispatched without delay to London. This, in fact, is the claim made later in a sympathetic biography of Menzies written by one of his close friends. If true, it seems likely Menzies had failed to allow for Churchill's continuing ability to short-circuit his plans. Then again, Menzies' control of his own destiny was increasingly slipping from his grasp, and his resignation was probably a last-ditch attempt to reassert some control over events. End quote. So Menzies is out, and there's like another two chapters of him as a backbencher trying to maneuver some more, but really within a couple of months, Germany had attacked the Soviet Union, bringing Russia into the war, and a few months a few months before his resignation, and a few months after the US entered the war, and this effectively changed the situation, and Churchill was no longer vulnerable. I guess Menzies didn't see any need for him to be in the war cabinet in London anymore, and he didn't end up going.
It's really sad because at this point, the empire.
Yeah.
Obviously we're nativists, but I mean, if you look at Australian history, the empire was fundamentally very important. Obviously, that's where we come from. That's where our institutions are, but also our protection against Asia. We were so reliant on the British fleet and all of that. And I think had the empire been preserved, we might not be looking at such a bad political situation now. Yeah, I don't know. There's a whole discussion to be had around that.
Before we move on to this Anne Henderson article quickly, I just want to ask you, what's your read? What does David Day think of Menzies? What is his opinion of him after reading the book?
Yeah, I think you were right earlier when you said that he often has these little snide remarks where he's attacking Menzies and sort of trying to sabotage Menzies' image to the reader. I think I'm not super familiar with Day and what his political sympathies are. So, but yeah, he seemed pretty hostile to Menzies, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot more, I guess, outside of this time period, things that could have been sort of brought into this to be more critical of Menzies, but he doesn't bring them in. So I guess that's just interesting. All right, we're going to read an extract from. This is an article that was published in Quadrant. It's called "Dreams of Menzies in Wartime London," and it's by Anne Henderson, and she's from the Sydney Institute. I think she's the deputy director of the Sydney Institute, which is like a conservative think tank. And she wrote she's written a couple of books. She's history books, one about Menzies. So I guess she's a subject matter expert, and she's written a review of Menzies and Churchill at War.
I might just reiterate at the start. She mentions what Day's argument is, so that's how we recall what we're talking about. But she says his central thesis is that Menzies was an empire man leading Australia at a time when the Second World War was going badly through England. Day argues that Menzies continued to support the appeasement of Germany after the declaration of war, disagreeing with Churchill's approach, and travelled to Britain in early 1941 to save the empire by replacing Churchill with himself. And she goes on to say that there's not a lot of evidence for this, but we'll do a little excerpt from the middle because she kind of goes through a few points. So, quote: "Time after time, Day makes assertions that sound bold, but then prove to have no visible means of support. On page 2 of Menzies and Churchill at War, for instance, he asserts that Menzies also took to London, a continuing commitment to the largely discredited policy of appeasement. Day offers no evidence to support such a statement, nor is there evidence for it anywhere else. Menzies was a stalwart supporter of British action from September 1939 until the end of the war. All Western leaders in the late 1930s had stuck with a policy of appeasement, even up to the latter part of 1939. But it was Neville Chamberlain and Menzies who eventually declared war on Hitler at the beginning of September 1939, and it was Menzies who committed Australian troops to the war against Hitler. The Australian Labor Party opposed that commitment until halfway through 1940. Menzies was no appeaser after September 1939. There is no evidence in private or on the public record to suggest otherwise. Day will have none of this, asserting on page 253 that if the peak of Menzies' ambition was to be found in Downing Street and the purpose was to save the British Empire, the means was to be found in a negotiated peace with Germany. On page 7, Day states that Menzies favoured peace in August 1939. Yes, he did, as did just about every Western leader, Roosevelt among them. The horror of the First World War had transfixed the Western world for 2 decades. The idea of another blood sacrifice of young men was hard to accept. But while Chamberlain and Menzies committed troops to the conflict with Nazi Germany in late 1939, President Roosevelt in the USA promised his citizens during the 1940 presidential election that no US soldier would be sent to fight Hitler. There is evidence, however, that Stanley Melbourne Bruce, Australia's High Commissioner in London, was of the view that deals could be done with Hitler through Mussolini. Lord Halifax had taken the same view in May 1940 when Churchill, with the British Expeditionary Force trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, stood up to him and used the outer cabinet to support his belief that Britain should fight on. But there is no evidence of such activity. Quite the contrary. Any comments so far?
I think she's overstating that there's no evidence. I think there's no like clear evidence. I think there's plenty of indications in the diary entries and letters, things that David Day quotes. I think there is a clear indication that that Menzies was not as stalwart a supporter of the war as is being claimed here.
Yeah. I think Day pushes his thesis too far. On the other hand, I think, as he points out, with evidence to back it, Menzies was much less inclined to waste troops. He was not so war hungry as Churchill, which I guess isn't hard because Churchill was basically a maniac. But but like I think, I mean he was for waging the war, but he probably definitely when it was going badly, I think if he was in Churchill's position, he would have negotiated. So yeah, that is kind of speculative, I suppose, and I guess Anne Henderson is kind of right to push for sticking with the evidence and what can be pulled out of it. But I guess another part of history is kind of that imagination because you don't always have the full picture based on the evidence. And I think Day is very good at kind of drawing on threads to create like a pretty reasonable possible view of how Menzies was approaching things.
What does Anne Henderson want? Does she want the like end of a superhero movie where the villain reveals his plot, before it's overturned? Like we're looking at something that it's a conspiracy. You're going to have to connect the dots and decide for yourself to say like, oh well, Menzies didn't come out and say I'm secretly planning to overthrow Churchill, so therefore there is no evidence. It's just kind of silly. Like it's both of these are too far in the extremes.
Yeah. All right, let's read on a little bit. So from a bit more from Henderson. Though the idea of a negotiated settlement continued to circulate in London as the war against Hitler went badly through 1941, and though many of those Menzies met in London could be said to have shared that idea, At no stage was there any sign that Menzies agreed with them. Indeed, as late as April 29, 1941, on the eve of his departure from London, after a cable from the acting Australian Prime Minister Arthur Fadden queried to what extent there was support for a compromise peace, Menzies was, as Day admits, startled by the suggestion. He cabled back to Fadden that there was, quote, no section of the United Kingdom government which has in mind possibility of concluding peace with Germany, end quote. Yet Day ignores the evidence of what this says of Menzies. On page 59, however, Day is forced to admit that on arrival in London, Menzies' message was simple and designed to evoke a ready response. Britain, he said, was not alone. The whole empire was behind her and would go all out to win, end quote. These are not the words of an appeaser. But what need of evidence or even mere plausibility when the historian can simply imagine for himself what the statesman thought, said, or did? On page 23, Day asserts that as Menzies and Churchill disagreed over the need for additional defence support for the Pacific Dominions, and here she's got a quote from Day, quote, it seemed to Menzies, Churchill's, wildly aggressive policies threatened to destroy not only the empire, but Britain itself. This was then the basis of Menzies' modern crusade, to rescue the imperial force from the infidel Churchill, and if need be, come to terms with the enemy at the gates. Firstly, though, Britain would have to be made secure from the imminent threat of invasion, end quote. Not even a footnote from Day supports this assertion. His technique is mockery and simple ridicule. Day set out to paint Menzies as an empire buffoon. The real Menzies, who admired and respected Churchill, even as he disputed Churchill's war tactics, does not feature here. Day constructs a Menzies who did not exist. Again, just a comment. I think you're right in that Henderson is pushing back probably too hard against Day. But on the other hand, I never really was fully convinced from Day that Menzies actually wanted to replace Churchill. He definitely wanted to push back against Churchill. He definitely wanted to curb Churchill's dominance of the war cabinet, and possibly that could lead to a negotiated peace, because I think really Churchill was the key driving factor in how the empire conducted the war. But yeah, like again, in the sense of being an appeaser in some sort of negative sense, I didn't really get that sense of Menzies. I don't know. Do you reckon he was an appeaser?
Well, like if you look at the situation they were in before the Soviet Union and the Americans entered the war, they should have been appeasing. That it was an absolutely ridiculous concept to continue on with this war that they had pretty much no chance of winning. So I don't think it would have been. I wouldn't view an appeaser in the same negative light that perhaps Mrs. Henderson would.
Yeah, and all of these, these historians write with kind of modern political objectives, which is kind of one of the reasons to look at history. I mean, we're the same. We look at history to kind of draw lessons and, look at how our own positions fit in with that and how things perhaps could have been better. And ultimately, if Menzies was going to roll Churchill and try and end the war, that would have been probably the best move the empire could have made. And to be fair, if we think about what happens, I think right after Greece is that Rudolf Hess parachutes into Britain or into Scotland, I think it was.
Yeah, it was Scotland.
Yeah, right. And he basically thought that there was going to be appetite for a negotiated peace at that point. And, had that been able to be carried through, I think that would have been fundamentally a good thing.
Well, Rudolf Hess's flight is included in the book, but it gets like a very short, sort of 2-paragraph treatment. And there is, I think, the common, the accepted explanation is that Rudolf Hess was crazy and he was into astrology, and the stars said that he should fly there, or something like that. And that's, to me, that sounds like nonsense. I think he had received some sort of communication that there was a faction in Britain that was ready and prepared to negotiate a peace. And
yeah, and that would probably support Day's thesis as well.
I think it just makes sense that there would be the situation that they were in. It makes total sense that there would have been a faction of people that were like, "Why are we doing this? We need to stop this." And it also makes sense that there would have not just been one plot, to get Rudolf Hess to come over and negotiate a peace, but there probably would have been 10 plots or 20 plots, and they would have been looking for a replacement for Churchill. And I think there is like a real possibility that Menzies was considered as a potential replacement for Churchill. But the bit that David Day leaves out is that he was probably one of 5 or 10 blokes that were in that position where they were being considered as, could this guy be a replacement for Churchill? Could we maneuver them into the right place and get rid of this guy and get our guy in there? And that's when you look at it like that. I think it all sort of seems a lot more plausible, and Menzies' role kind of makes more sense.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, one of the problems with the book might be that it's so Menzies centric that you might be missing out on some of these other parts of the picture that might actually help make the thesis a bit more plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, well, David Day dare not go into the he's exploring the cabal that supposedly was promoting Menzies, but he dare not mention anything about a cabal that is promoting Winston Churchill and got him into the position that he's in. I think that's a bridge too far for David Day.
Yeah, in all honesty, I just don't know enough about the Churchill stuff to actually make an educated comment on it. Like I have read a little bit about it, or like little snippets here and there, and obviously Churchill writes this thing, Zionism versus Bolshevism, the struggle for the Jewish soul, and he's kind of involved in those circles, and I believe he was put in by what's the name of that banker, the Rothschilds or something? Was that right? He was bailed out or something. Yeah. Again, see, this is the problem. Like,
yeah, no, I haven't.
We're starting to get out. I'm too parochial. I only know about Australia.
Oh well, that's what we're here to learn. So, all right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff here. It's kind of speculative. When we look at the big picture, though, the thing that I keep coming back to is that in Australia we had the correct perception, because we were kind of on the frontier of Western civilization. We had the correct perception that we need to kind of put these brother wars aside and focus on the real enemy in Asia. And we've done, obviously, together, Trent, the Charles Pearson podcast on national life and character, where we were already having in Australia in the late 19th century these intimations that all is not well with Western civilization, that there is a coming turn where we're going to be losing our grip on world power, and these other nations are going to rise up and challenge our supremacy. And obviously World War II is a key turning point here because of the Japanese so clearly and seriously challenging Western power in the Pacific, and their whole justification with the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere and the propaganda around that was that it was a decolonization mission for Asia to throw off its European shackles and to rise up and to take pride of place in the world. And even though Japan lost, had the nukes dropped on it and all of that, the outcome really was that Asia did throw off its shackles. So, the Americans were very self-sabotaging for Western civilization, in the sense that they would push for the decolonization of the British Empire and Indian self-governance and all this other stuff. And we're kind of living in the results of this kind of meta strategic era of
living in the ruins.
Yeah. Meta strategic era of kind of European leaders focusing on these kind of wars of Europe that are coming out of European history and Britain's strategic imperative to divide and conquer on the continent and continental European stuff. And they didn't really focus on the problem of maintaining, Western white superiority across the world. So, yeah, I mean, obviously caught with their pants down in the Far East at the end of the day, because all the, as we saw with Menzies, he wasn't able to get anything moved across, and there wasn't really any interest in the heart of the empire to secure Australia.
All right. Well, I think we've been going for long enough. That was a longer one today. Shall we wrap up?
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Let us know in the comments what topics you would like to hear about from us, or if there is a particular topic relating to Australia or the ANA that you would like us to do a show on. As always, I'd encourage all our supporters in the audience to make sure you like and subscribe and share our content far and wide. We'd love to share our show with as many good Aussies as possible. Lastly, if you want to reach out, you can find us at oznatives.org. Thanks.
There is a land where summer skies are gleaming with 1,000 dyes, blending in witching harmonies, in harmonies. And grass in knoll and forest height are flushing in the rosy light, and all above is azure bright. Australia, Australia, Australia. There is a land where homesteads keep from sunny plain and woodland steep, and love and joy bright vigils keep, bright vigils keep. Where the glad voice of childish glee is mingling with the melody of nature's hidden minstrelsy. Australia, Australia, Australia. There is a land where floating free from mountain top to girdling sea, a proud flag waves exultingly, exultingly. And freedom the sun's the banner bear, no shackled slave can breathe the air. Fairest of Britain